board. The food investigations he's doing, very cool. And speaking of food, we know what not to eat based on that last segment. Of course, Dr. Nick Gonzalez, my good friend, is back on board here. And last week, Dr. Nick, we were talking about the ketogenic diet, and you want to go through very briefly the controversy and, of course, why you wanted to come back on board to talk more about extensive and explicit diets for those suffering with cancer.
Yeah, throughout the alternative world, there's this current hysteria and enthusiasm for the ketogenic diet for the treatment of cancer, which was proposed by Thomas Seyfried in a recent book, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease. And the conventional world has jumped on the bandwagon as well. This is basically the answer to cancer. What was very interesting when I read the 421-page book or whatever it is, this page after page after page of elaborate theory. I mean, chapter after chapter after elaborate theory. I love theory. Theory is a wonderful thing. But what was missing was real evidence. You get to the last chapter where he does have what he describes as case reports, and to my astonishment, there were exactly two. One written by the mother of a young boy who had brain cancer that was being treated with chemotherapy at the same time and had a 15% reduction in tumor, and then died. Which it's a tragic story, but I would never have included a case like that in any of the books I've written. The second case was a physician with myeloma diagnosed in 2009 after he fractured his arm, and 2 years later he was feeling pretty good, although he admitted there was no evidence that the disease had regressed. And I said, a 2-year survivor, gosh, when I was reviewing Kelly's cases, I had patients alive 10, 15 years later. I had a myeloma patient with stage 4 patient had multiple fractures, had failed aggressive chemo, was terminal, and Kelly turned around. She was alive 11 years out when I finished my report in 1987. So that was the kind of case that I would consider a good case, or some of the cases we've talked about, like the 31-year-old survivor of stage 4 pancreatic cancer, biopsy-proven liver metastases confirmed at the Mayo Clinic. She's alive and well, first diagnosed in 1982. A 2-year survivor of myeloma, which can be an indolent disease, or a patient with brain cancer, as tragic as it is, who had a 15% reduction while getting chemo, who died. I'm not trying to be difficult, but those are not extraordinary cases. I was extremely disappointed. Lots of theory, but no evidence.
And if I may, Dr. Nick, when you talk about theory, there is the theoretical. We know certain pathways exist. We know certain diets will affect those pathways in a certain way, and we can reasonably, make assumptions or hypotheses to say, hey, maybe this would be good for cancer. For instance, the ketogenic diet. On the surface, says, hey, it could be, but does it play itself out? Do we have enough evidence to say everybody should do a ketogenic diet? I think the answer is clearly no. But it's not that we're throwing the ketogenic diet under the bus. Last week when I had you on, we talked about its benefits, validated benefits for children with seizure disorders and other things. But the reality is, I'm concerned, as are you, what people should do when they're diagnosed with cancers from a dietary perspective. And where we agree to start is we've got to clean up everything that goes into the bodies of these people.
Well, one of the things that I've learned from studying the nutritional literature, going back to, you and I have discussed them before, Weston Price. Whenever you have a question about a new great miracle theory about nutrition, I always go back to Weston Price. Weston Price, for your listeners out there who don't know about him, I'm sure many of your listeners do. He was a dentist who graduated dental school, I think, 1899, and from the late 20s into the 30s, spent 7 years with his wife traveling the world, looking into traditional peoples that were isolated from the westernized civilization and Western ways of eating, who are still living according to their traditional lifestyle and still eating according to traditional practices. And he went around the world, from the Arctic of the Eskimos to the high Andes to the Kenyan Plains to the high Swiss Alps to Polynesia to the Maori in New Zealand, studying their diets. And what he learned is all of these people follow different types of diets. The Eskimo diet was an all-meat diet, 80% fat, 20% protein, and no fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grains up in the Arctic. The high Andes Inca descendants lived on a grain-based diet with lots of quinoa and tubers and some llama meat. The Kenyan Maasai warriors lived on an all-raw milk diet with some blood and a little bit of meat, but no fruits, vegetables again. And then the high Swiss herders lived on a nutrient-dense, very, very dense whole grain bread, along with grass-fed milk from grass-fed cattle cheese made from that milk. The Polynesians lived on a coconut-based diet. So the whole point of Price's work is that traditional peoples adopted to a variety of different diets depending on the food availability within their ecological niche. And these diets differed enormously. But what he also found, which is the most important point of his studies, that as long as these traditional peoples, be they, Aztec Indian descendants, or the Eskimos, or the Maasai, or the high Swiss Alpine herders, as long as they followed the traditional diets, they were in excellent, superb health. So the whole point is different people use different diets successfully.
Exactly. Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez is my guest the rest of the show today here on the Robert Scott Bell Show. We're going to talk about the individualization of diets, the dietary needs of each person that's diagnosed with cancer, and how to undo it. Dr. Nick is my guest. Thanks again for being here on the Healing Revolution on the Robert Scott Bell Show. We'll be right back.
Of the Constitution.
Robert Scott Bell.
We are most definitely ringing that bell today with Dr. Nick Gonzalez. Here we go. Yeah, jumping all over it here. Excited to have Dr. Nick Gonzalez back on the air with us here. Robert Scott Bell Show continues on naturalnewsradio.com along with GCN Live, co-branding all of this healing liberty basically here on the air. And talking to Dr. Nick, if you're not familiar with him, he's been working with patients for a long time now that were often given up for dead by the traditional allopathic oncological cancer doctor groups. And that includes some of the most devastating, most rapidly moving cancers like pancreatic cancer. He's written extensively on it, and his most recent book, What Went Wrong? The Truth Behind the Clinical Trial of the Enzyme Treatment of Cancer. And that is Dr. Nick Gonzalez, dr.gonzalez.com. The links are up in the show notes at robertscottbell.com. Dr. Nick, you were talking about the indigenous folks around planet Earth. In other words, like Weston Price visits these places, observes their diets. As long as they're on their so-called native indigenous diets, they're healthy. When they stray from them, suddenly illness is taking place, and generationally it's getting worse each generation. But the question I have for you, Dr. Nick, is here in the West, here in America, where I don't know what an indigenous diet is anymore. What do we eat? And people are desperately lost. And once they have cancer, they're even more lost. What are we going to do?
Well, there's certain problems. First, America is essentially a melting pot. Our ancestors came from all different areas where our great ancestors would have adopted to a variety of different diets. So it's kind of, there aren't these kind of pure traditional cultures living in isolation. And America is the antithesis of that. We have multiple cultures from multiple geographic backgrounds all mingling together and intermarrying. You get mixed genetics, so you get mixed dietary needs. The second problem, of course, is the industrialization of our food supply, which whatever your metabolic type and whatever type of diet you should be following genetically and metabolically, the food is terrible. I mean, it's chemicalized, GMOs, pesticide-laden, chemical-laden, refined, processed, synthetic. The synthetic foods that are out there just is horrible, the kind of things that happened after World War II when, better living through chemistry. And then the third biggest problem is experts. Experts are the biggest enemy to traditional nutritional education that there are, because most experts get one idea, like Dr. Seyfried, one idea, and he believes everyone should follow it. You have the Pritikin Ornish people that absolutely believe that all humans should be on a vegetarian diet, completely vegetarian, low-fat, 8%, 75% carbohydrate, which is actually the antithesis of Seyfried. Then you had Bob Atkins, who was kind of like the Seyfried, with a ketogenic diet with 75% fat, the exact mirror image, doppelganger of Pritikin and Ornish. And then you have Reven out of Stanford, believes all people should be on a kind of a mixed diet with fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grains, fish, poultry, meat. And you got all these experts writing best-selling books, all of them disagreeing with each other, none of them consistent, and all of its proponents absolutely believing that their approach is best for everybody. So it creates an enormous amount of confusion. And the wonderful thing is people get interested in nutrition, and then immediately they go to the library, they start buying books, and then they end up more confused and depressed because they don't know what to do, and they'll try different diets and end up sick. So it is a real problem in this country, and experts are the biggest problem there is. There are ways around that. First, it's kind of simple, Real good truths are always simple. My mentor, the great Dr. Kelly, said people tend to like the foods they should be eating. Yes, I know everybody likes chocolate. Let's forget about chocolate for a minute. A genetic meat eater, an Eskimo, someone who should be eating meat, likes meat. They love it. They don't want to eat salads. They don't want to eat fruits. If some idiot expert tells them they should be eating fruits, those people shouldn't be eating fruits. They shouldn't be eating salads. They should be having bacon for dessert, and that's exactly what they want. A real genetic meat eater will dream about pot roast and bacon. They don't dream about salads and what they think is rapid food. They force themselves to eat that stuff, and they get sick on it because it's not suited for their metabolism. A genetic vegetarian gags at the thought of pot roast. They just don't like it. They don't want to eat bacon. They want to have maybe a piece of fruit for breakfast. They don't tend to eat a lot of food. They don't tend to need a lot amount of food. They want a salad for lunch, and they do fine on that. These are people that can have a light lunch and do great, whereas the meat eaters need heavy meals with lots of fat and gravy and butter and all that stuff, and they do great on it. Balanced people like a variety of foods. Kelly used to say a balanced person, you'll lose at a smorgasbord, a buffet, and they'll pick and choose from the plant-based side and the animal-based side, and they can eat cheese and do great with it. So usually your own instincts are pretty good in determining what kind of food you should be eating. If you gag at the thought of pot roast or gag at the thought of salad, you already know a lot about your metabolism. If you like a variety of foods, then you're kind of a balanced metabolizer. A lot of people in America are balanced because of the mixing of genes. They end up balanced. So if you go by your own instincts, your own tastes and preferences, often that will lead you in the right direction far more accurately than some expert with, a bone to pick who believes everyone should be following his particular diet, period. No way.
Well, yeah, we do find that what you're saying is accurate, that those that get on their discovery of a diet that's right and it's right for everybody. My perspective has been, as a homeopath, I need to individualize everything that I do, although I'll find commonalities. And I said, from a dietary perspective, the commonality is that none of us need toxic food. Period. I mean, we don't. We got to clean it up. But the question is, in an area where you don't have a native population, you don't have an indigenous diet, you said it right. People are more confused than ever. They come to you for help, Dr. Nick, with serious problems. And do you just go on what they're craving? I don't think so. I mean, there are probably some other things people should consider or could consider to test them to see, hey, what would work for them when they don't know?
Well, we have special tests that we develop. We use a hair test that we designed specifically for our use. Very precisely and very accurate, tells us which specific diet patients need. We have 10 basic diets and dozens of variations, and then we individualize it even more. So it's very complex biochemically and physiologically, but our tests really sort through their confusion very quickly, but, they're not commercially available. The academic world didn't take me seriously. They don't care about different diets for different types. They could care less. They think people can eat junk food and do great. The basic food groups, junk food and soda. Mm-hmm. So that's what they think. So these tests that we run, which are very accurate, are not commercially available, so that kind of limits in terms of the availability of objective testing. And, the mainstream world and the alternative world, as you and I have discussed, and maybe there's some interest now, but there's not a lot of interest in thinking about the fact that different people need different diets. Virtually every practitioner in the alternative world, be a chiropractor, osteopath, physician, knows about Weston Price, either they've read him or heard about him, and they seem to forget the lesson. The lesson is different people need different diets. An Eskimo never ate coconut, the Polynesians never ate whale blubber, yet each group thrived on the diet that they were adjusted to. Those groups were extremely healthy. That's Price's whole point. But they were different types of diet, different levels of protein, fats, carbs, different types of food, completely different types of food. The Polynesians never saw quinoa, and they didn't drink milk, but they used coconut as an equivalent. They had coconut milk and coconut meat and coconut cream. So they adjusted to their environment and did great. So there really aren't, the academic world isn't interested in that. The alternative world largely isn't. Even some well-known alternative practitioners, they treat everyone the same. They might throw this vitamin or that mineral and do, $2,000 worth of testing to determine what's in the stool that they need to address. But they don't think about the most important fundamental aspect of nutrition is that the diet is fuel. We're an engine that needs the right fuel. You give the wrong fuel to the engine of the body, and it's not going to work, no matter what you do nutritionally in terms of supplements.
Dr. Nick, as far as simplicity, I mean, there are those like Dr. D'Adamo who talked about blood type diets. Have you found it ever as simple as that? Oh, and O is a meat eater and A is not, that kind of thing?
Well, again, as I've said before in your show, as the Bible instructs us, try and live at peace with all men, so I try not to be too critical of other
I know.
people.
You're a good guy.
Kelly knew D'Adamo's father, who first proposed this whole leptin theory that the different blood types adjusted to different diets. Now, to D'Adamo's credit, and I do credit him for this, he realized different people need different diets. That's a step in the right direction. The problem is he saw only 4 different types, the 4 basic blood types, A, B, and O. And he absolutely believed that, type O should be meat eaters, type A should be vegetarians, AB should be balanced, etc. We find that not to be accurate. We find it not to be the case. I had just yesterday had a person on a type O diet. He's actually a chiropractor that read D'Adamo's work. He's a type O blood type. Went on a meat diet, and it was the worst thing for him because he's a genetic vegetarian. He said he felt terrible on it. And not only that, and this is a guy who was eating organically, taking supplements. He's a chiropractor, a very good one down south, does kinesiology, muscle testing. He's into energetic working. So even among chiropractors, he's kind of avant-garde. So he followed this diet religiously and ends up with lung cancer. And you can imagine, as an alternative practitioner interested in nutrition, reading all this stuff, following his dictates, you end up with lung cancer. Well, what happened is it was exactly the wrong diet for him. He's a genetic plant-based vegetarian type. He needs to be on fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grains. And I asked him yesterday, I said, how did you feel on the type O meat diet with lots of fat? He said he felt terrible on it. It was gunking up his metabolism. It wasn't the right fuel for his cells. It wasn't the right fuel for his tissues and organs, and it wasn't working efficiently. And lo and behold, he ends up with lung cancer, eating organically for years. So we're putting him on a plant-based. He just started with me. We're putting him on a plant-based diet with limited amounts of animal protein, fish, no poultry, no red meat, some eggs, yogurt, minimal amount, lots of fruits, vegetables, carrot juice. What happened with him is genetic vegetarians tend to run on the acid side, and solid tumors like tumors of the breast, lung, stomach, pancreas, colon, liver, uterus, ovary, prostate thrive in an acid environment. And what happened with him is the meat diet, which has lots of sulfates and phosphates and other nutrients that push the body acid, pushed him so acid he ended up with lung cancer. He had been a smoker years ago before he went to chiropractic school, so that was kind of a weak area to start with.
Sure, yeah, and of course these cancers tend to pop up in areas of weakness, and that weakness might not be genetic inherently, but it might be something that was environmental, or as you said, from smoking, made that the Achilles area where it played itself out. It's fascinating, again, when you get to the practical, clinical, the observational, going back to Weston Price, what you have done with Dr. Kelly, and you, Dr. Nick, yourself have said this. We don't want to overcomplicate it, nor do we want to oversimplify. We know everybody's got to clean up what's going in, and that's a very difficult task because so much of the environment has been polluted, and we got to do our level best to do so. But finding out what is the right diet, it's been one of the most asked questions here over the years. What is the right diet for me? And it's like, I can give you some generalities, but in this case, sometimes it takes specificity. Sometimes it will take some sort of testing to determine it if your body metabolism is so aberrant at that point.
One of my biggest frustrations, I've been doing this for 26 years. Kelly had done it 20 years before me, and he had all this theory and all the practicalities of how to determine the different types 30 years ago, but no one took him seriously. He was the crazy dentist who messed with Steve McQueen, etc. That whole story. No one took him seriously, and no one takes us in the academic world takes us seriously today. So all of this valuable technology, which we use in our office, is not generally available. And I don't say that I want this to be my own paranoid secret from the world. I wish it were out there in the world. That was my intent 25 years ago when I started doing this. That's why we did that clinical study that was sabotaged, because we wanted this to be out there in the world. So there is no simple way of doing it. And the blood typing, which you brought up, is not an accurate way at all that we find. And in terms of, what can we do? This guy is the guy was talking about, true story. I didn't make this up for the purposes of the show. An extremely experienced chiropractor that went on exactly the wrong diet, and he's been eating organically for years and ended up with lung cancer. So that's how important it is to be on the right diet and avoid the wrong diet. So people out there are going to get scared. My God, I'm afraid to eat my next meal.
No, we don't want that. We're going to come back and... Yeah, we're going to come back and wrap it up with Dr. Nick Gonzalez here to get you past the fear of what do you eat now that you've heard Dr. Gonzalez talk about the fact that it may not be as simple as you think, but then again, it might be at the same time. How could that be? We're going to find out on the other side of this break right here. Check it all out. Links are up at robertscottbell.com. The power to heal is yours. We're just here to remind you. So stand by. We'll be back with Dr. Nick after this.
You're listening to the Robert Scott Bell Show.
All right, special thanks to Liam Sheff for joining us today, Dr. Frank King, of course, Mike Adams, Super Don behind the scenes there, and Dr. Nick Gonzalez, who's on with me now to wrap up the show into the weekend, Healing Revolution Friday. Say thanks to all our wonderful sponsors. If you're not sure who they are, just go to robertscottbell.com. They're embedded in the show notes. We've got links and banners. And, of course, thanks as well to Natural News Radio, where all of the archives will be up, as well as GCN, which carries the archives as well, and I embed them in the show notes. For those of you worried about what you've heard so far from Dr. Nick, it's awesome, but I know he's really rapid in his delivery there, and you'll want to re-listen. That's why we have the archives available for free. And Dr. Nick, it's always a blast to get together with you. And for those that, we're concerned about that say, well, now I'm confused. I thought I had the diet right. I'm not sure now. What do I do? Is there a simpler method? Is there any way I can figure this thing out?
Well, there actually is. It's the simple Kelly niacin test that he developed some 35 years ago. Niacin, as many of your listeners will know, produces a flush, and you feel it. You feel like you turn red, and you feel this kind of itching and warmth. And he suggested that people should get a 50 milligram tablet, which is a very low dose, and take it on an empty stomach. Now, meat eaters don't tolerate niacin well at all. They get a terrible flush. They feel terrible and dysphoric. It goes on for an hour or two, even with a low dose. The vegetarian types get virtually no flush at all. Balanced people get a mild to moderate flush. And as crude as that sounds, that's a simple test. You just get a 50-milligram tablet of niacin and try it. If you get a terrible flush that's really uncomfortable, you know you're a genetic meat eater. If you get no flush at all, you're a genetic vegetarian. If you get a mild to moderate flush that doesn't really bother you, but you're aware of it, you're probably balanced and eat a variety of foods. So that's a simple test. As silly as it sounds, very effective. So get some 50-milligram tablets of niacin. Just try one. And on an empty stomach. You got to do it on an empty stomach. And that really will help tell you, at least in general direction. Yes, we have 3 different kinds of vegetarian diets, 3 different meat diets, 4 balanced, and then subtypes, et cetera. But at least that will point you in the right direction. But again, as simplistic as it sounds, also your cravings and tendencies with the kind of foods you like will tell you a lot about what your metabolic needs really are. We tend to crave the foods we need. Some people crave chocolate, and often there's a reason, because there's magnesium in chocolate. So there's a reason. Usually they need magnesium. Sometimes they need the fats. There are other nutrients in chocolate that are not found anywhere else that can stimulate. So people depressed tend to take chocolate, not just for it feels good, it brings back childhood memories. That's not the only reason. And actually there are neurotransmitter precursors in chocolate that stimulate the brain into kind of a happier mode. So the kind of foods you crave often tell you a lot about what you should be eating. But the niacin test is a pretty accurate assessment of what your general metabolic type is.
Nice. Well, you've simplified it in a brilliant way, so now nobody can panic. Nobody has to panic out there. Remember, don't panic. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Just go right back to that. Now, Dr. Nick, you're working on your next book, which is going to have like 120 or something case histories. And we've joked about this idea that you could be Clint Eastwood, go ahead, match my cases, for those that have criticized you and said, no, it's not real. These people didn't really have cancer that are alive 25 years later, having seen you. So I hear you're about 100 through. It's amazing what you're doing.
Yeah, we got about 100 done. As I was telling you during the break, some of these cases go back 25 years, and every patient, and they're all heroes. Every patient's a hero. These are people that faced cancer, terrible death. A lot of them had terminal prognoses, had failed standard therapy, and here they are, alive 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years later. I've been in practice 26 years now. Hard to believe. And each one has an individual story. Not only are they heroes, but they're heroes in different ways. Many of them had to fight their conventional doctors who thought this was quackery and they shouldn't be doing this. They're throwing their lives away. And here they are years later. In some of the cases, the doctors died of cancer and the patients are still alive, because I'm following these patients for so long. They have these elaborate histories. And as I go through each chart, I sometimes forget, because I have so many patients, and so many of these patients have been patients for so long, you don't remember the details of their story, of their battle, of their war, of their heroism. And you just see it in the records. And writing these patients up, it's inspiring to me. Not, I'm a great doctor. No, it's because of the patients. They're so inspiring. The choices they made. 20, 25 years ago when I first started, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in alternative medicine. You mentioned cancer and diet in the same sentence. That was almost like a felony, as I've said
yes.
before.
Yes.
That's changed somewhat. In fact, I have collegial relationships with doctors and conventional oncologists, even doctors at Sloan Kettering, because they've seen my patients get well, so they start treating me like an equal, which is a wonderful change, because we should all be working together without the animus and antagonism between us. So there's been a big change, but it's interesting to go through these patient charts and see a lot of it 20 years ago, the battles they had to fight to come see me, and the family members were doubtful. I hadn't been in practice that long. Who is this guy in New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're really, fascinating stories, and I have to credit the patients. Boy, what a bunch of heroes they are.
Well, what a hero you are to me, and a good friend. I appreciate you so very much. Everybody check him out, Dr.Gonzalez, dr-gonzalez.com. The links are up in the show notes at robertscottbell.com. You can always re-listen at naturalnewsradio.com to the archives, as well as through gcnlive.com. And the links will be up through the show notes at robertscottbell.com. Listen, we have done it again. Dr. Nick, you've helped me so much to remind each and every one of you out there. What is it? You know it's true. The power to heal is yours.
The Robert Scott Bell Show.